Welcome to the 8th annual conference of the Weston A. Price Foundation. We are delighted to see you here. And the subject of our seminar today is Nourishing Traditional Diets, the Key to Vibrant Health. The burning question that we are asking ourselves and seeking the answer for: what is a healthy diet? And I'm sure that you're all as confused as the general population about what a healthy diet is. I think everyone has a fairly general idea that how we eat has something to do with how healthy we are. But there's so many conflicting claims about what constitutes a healthy diet. Is it the Atkins diet, based largely on animal foods? Is it a vegetarian or vegan diet that avoids animal foods? And then all of these other dietary schemes for which many claims are made: the zone diet, the macrobiotic diet, the South Beach diet. How can we make sense of all of these conflicting claims? Even Lisa Simpson, who's a very smart young lady, even Lisa Simpson is confused. And then, of course, we have the U.S. government official diet. With the food pyramid and resulting in all these pyramidal-shaped people. And believe me, the rationale for this diet is not to make you healthy. It is to promote the products of commodity agriculture, because that's what the U.S. Department of Agriculture is set up to do, is promote commodity agriculture. In order to answer this question, what is a healthy diet, we turn to the pioneer of nutrition research, Dr. Weston Price. Dr. Price was a dentist, actually. His practice was in Cleveland, Ohio. He was a very successful dentist for his day. And he had a lot of patients who asked him, what is a healthy diet? How can I be healthier? And Dr. Price did not know the answer to this question. What he did know is that he was seeing increasing levels of disease among his patients. Dental caries, cavities, infection in the mouth, and also what he referred to as dental deformities. We have a different way of saying that. We say crooked teeth, crowded teeth. But he was seeing all sorts of problems in the development of the jaw and the teeth. And what he noticed and what he observed was that people who had poor dental health, people who had cavities, who had infection, people who had crowded and crooked teeth and overbites, generally had poor overall health. The teeth were a mirror to the rest of the body. And he was concerned because it seemed like the health of the American population was deteriorating and getting worse and worse, at least based on what he was seeing in his practice. Now, this was a time back in the 30s, and actually this was the early 20s when he started his practice, when the world was opening up. There were sections of the globe that had been discovered and isolated populations described and photographed. And one of the most common observations that Westerners had when they discovered these isolated people was what beautiful teeth they had. Even the first settlers to America described in their diaries the Native Americans as having teeth broad and straight and white as piano keys. And this intrigued Dr. Price very much because this is not what he was seeing in his practice. He was seeing decay. He was seeing blackened, crooked, unattractive teeth. Well, Dr. Price decided that he was going to see for himself whether these reports were true. And so he embarked on a series of investigations that took him 10 years to complete and took him to many isolated parts of the globe in order to answer two questions. The first question was it true? Was it true that isolated people living far from all the so-called benefits of civilization had excellent dental health? They did not suffer from cavities. They did not have dental deformities. And by inference, if they had good dental health, good overall health. The second question was, if he could find these healthy populations, what were they eating? What was a the type of diet that supported this kind of health. He was not interested in what unhealthy people were eating. He knew what unhealthy people were eating. He knew what his patients were eating. But he didn't know what to tell them to eat to be healthy. So that was the genius of Dr. Price. He asked the right questions, and then he very systematically went about answering those questions. The first place that Dr. Price went was an isolated valley in Switzerland. Switzerland at this time in the early 1930s had embarked on a road building project to connect all the villages and all the towns in Switzerland. But he found a few villages that were still not connected to the road. This particular village was in the Lowenschel Valley. This village was at the end of a valley surrounded by very steep mountain ranges. And the only access to this village was a footpath too narrow for a wheeled cart. That way he was assured that the foods that they were eating, they grew there in the village for themselves, with the exception of salt, which was carried in. They did not have salt. Now, when he came to a tribe or a village, the way he worked was he sat down with the elders and with the help of an interpreter, he explained his research. And when he had their permission, he then took every individual from the village, young and old, sick, no exceptions. He wasn't leaving out people deliberately. And he lined them all up, and then he very carefully looked in every single mouth and meticulously counted cavities. And that part of his research, he kept little notebooks. It was very precise and scientific. He also noted the presence of dental deformities. And this part of his research was published in peer-reviewed journals of his day. He also took general notes about the health of the population based on his observations. And then he made notes about the food. He described the foods that they were eating. And he took samples of the foods back to his laboratory in Cleveland and analyzed them for nutrient content. So this was the way that Dr. Price worked. It was actually a very scientific way of working to answer these two specific questions that he had. Well, you can imagine the amazement of the dentist from Cleveland, Ohio, coming to this isolated village in Switzerland and lining up, first of all the children. And he had to look in 3 mouths before he found even one tooth that had evidence of decay. So there was less than 1% tooth decay among the children in the Swiss village. And every child, every individual in the village had naturally straight teeth. No one needed braces. There were no dental deformities. He described the children's faces as broad. Their nostrils were broad, had very good facial construction. They were also very sturdy. They played barefooted in the freezing water of the running streams during weather in which he and his wife had to wear heavy overcoats. The Price Pottenger Nutrition Foundation has just released another photograph from Switzerland, and you can see how round the children's faces are. Very good facial development, allowing plenty of space in the jaw for the teeth to come in straight. By the way, the children did not brush their teeth. They didn't have toothpaste, they didn't have fluoride treatments. In fact, he very delicately described their teeth as being covered with green slime, but they were not decayed. He also, of course, looked at the adults, and he found the same situation in the adults. Virtually no tooth decay and no dental deformities, very straight teeth. The men in the village were known for their great strength. They routinely won the athletic contests held throughout Switzerland, and the women were known for their great beauty from this particular village. When he talked to the health officials in Switzerland, he learned from them that there had never been a case of tuberculosis in these few isolated Swiss villages. And this was a time when tuberculosis was a huge problem in the rest of Switzerland. It was the #1 killer, not only in Switzerland, but throughout Europe. But these people seem to be completely immune to tuberculosis. So here we are in the Swiss village, the first place that he visited, with his first question: could he find a healthy population? And he's answered this question with a yes. He's found a population with excellent dental health, from all he can determine, excellent overall health. So we go now to the next question: what were these people eating? The #1 source of calories in the Swiss village was the very food accused of causing tuberculosis in the rest of the world. It was raw milk. These people kept cattle and goats grazed on the lush green pasture beneath the melting glaciers. And the chief source of calories in the diet was raw milk, and then raw cheese, raw butter, and raw cream. And the other major source of calories was a special type of bread. They grew rye in the short summer season, and they made a very dense sourdough rye bread. And that was the source of calories. It was basically rye bread and raw milk. And I find this very interesting because one of the theories that we have out there about why we have so many health problems today is because we're eating these two foods that are new to the human diet, dairy foods and grains. There are a number of writers who say to be healthy, you need to avoid dairy foods and grains. And yet here was a supremely healthy population whose main source of calories was dairy foods and grains. But the dairy foods they were consuming were very different from the dairy foods that we buy today in the supermarket, and the grains were prepared in a much different way than we prepare our grains today. We'll talk about both of these later on in the seminar. They also did eat meat, usually once a week, usually veal. They ate the whole animal, including the organ meats. The bones were used to make soup. And they grew vegetables in their gardens during the summer and had a few vegetables in the warmer months. But basically, this was a diet based on dairy foods and grains. A typical lunch for the children going to school would be a very thick slice of the dense sourdough rye bread and an equally thick slice of the beautiful raw Swiss cheese. Every culture that he went to had one or more sacred foods. The sacred foods were considered very important for pregnant women, nursing mothers, and growing children. These cultures seem to recognize in a way that we have forgotten that nutrition is absolutely vital during that period when the baby is being formed and growing. When the body is being formed, you can't go back in later years and form a perfect body. And the very nutrient-dense food needs to be supplied during that growth period. The sacred food for the Swiss villagers was a very special type of butter. It was the butter that came from the cows when they first went to pasture in the spring. This butter was a deep orange color. And so much did they honor this butter that they had a special ceremony in their churches where they lit a bowl of the butter. They had a wick in the bowl of butter on the altar in their churches to honor the life-giving force in the butter. That was a very special ceremony for the first butter in the spring. Here's a picture of their bread. This is a festival loaf, a very large loaf of bread. It will probably weigh 15 or 20 pounds. Very dense bread. It takes a couple of days to make this bread. There's no yeast used. It's a sourdough method that's a type of fermentation. We'll come back to this subject later on. They put a hole in the bread so they can hang it up on a hook, and it actually is allowed to cure for 2 weeks before they eat the bread. So there's a very long and careful preparation of the grains, a common theme in traditional cultures. Notice the wonderful bone structure of the woman, especially this part of the face, the middle third of the face. She has very broad cheekbones. That's what gives beauty to the human face. She's nice and slender in spite of her high-fat diet. And what I like best about this photograph is the hat. The splendid health and physical attractiveness and resistance to disease that he found among the so-called primitive Swiss villagers was in stark contrast to what he found in the villages connected to the outside world by a road. As soon as the roads came to the village, stores were opened, and the stores carried what he called the displacing foods of modern commerce. These are foods based on sugar, white flour, canned foods, canned condensed milk, chocolates, candies, jams, jellies, pastries, and so forth. When the roads came to the village, the first thing that happened was that people began to suffer from tooth decay. In these villages with roads, he found that 1 tooth in 3 was decayed. And you can imagine the suffering that this caused because the foods causing the decay had arrived in these villages, but it took a while for the dentist to get there. But what concerned him the most was the children who were born after the road came to the village. As soon as the food shops opened up and people started eating these foods, the children born after that time had dental deformities. Their faces were more narrow, their jaws did not have room for the teeth to come in straight. So you started to see crooked teeth, crowded mouths, overbites, and underbites. And the other thing that occurred as soon as the roads came was tuberculosis. The scourge of civilization, it just became a huge problem when people began to eat the processed, refined foods. The next place that Dr. Price went, and he only looked at two Caucasian or European cultures. One was the Swiss culture, and the other were the Gaelic people living on a very windswept island off the coast of Scotland in the Outer Hebrides. Here he once again found a high degree of physical perfection, virtually no cavities, good facial development. Now the Gaelic face will be more narrow genetically than the Alpine face. Nevertheless, there was plenty of room for the teeth to come in straight. He was also struck by the outlook of these people. They had a wonderful spiritual view of life. They were very cheerful and optimistic, living on this grim, windswept island with no television, no casinos, no video games. Now, these people had a very different diet from the Swiss villagers. They lived on an island that was very rocky. They had no animals there, so they had no meat in their diet, no eggs, no dairy foods. They couldn't grow fruits and vegetables there, so no fruits, no vegetables. What in the world were these people eating? Well, their diet was based on seafood of every imaginable type, various types of fish, shellfish, oysters, clams, and they ate the heads of the fish, the organ meats of the fish. The one green food they had was seaweed. And they also were able to grow oats on the island, so they had porridge and oat cakes. So this was a diet based on seafood and oats. The sacred food, the food that growing children got every morning for breakfast so they'd grow up healthy and strong, was cod's head stuffed with oats and chopped cod's liver. The soil on the island was very poor, and so they had to put a type of fertilizer on the soil, and the fertilizer was the thatch from their cottages. They lived in these cottages that had no chimneys, and during the winter the thatch would become black with the smoke, and they would re-thatch in the spring and take all of that blackened thatch and put it on the fields, and that was how they got a mature crop of oats. Dr. Price actually took some of the island soil home with him and planted oats in it. These are oats planted in the soil with no amendment. These are various types of commercial fertilizers added to the soil, and the only pot that gave him a mature crop of oats was this island soil that had the thatch added to it. So they very much understood the principle of soil fertility and the need to add nutrients to the soil to get good growth there. Now, in some of the islands that Dr. Price went to where they had trading posts there and people were starting to eat food from the outside, tuberculosis became a huge problem. And the health workers told them that they were getting tuberculosis because they lived in these smoke-filled cottages all winter long. And these were very smoky cottages, breathing in this smoke all winter. So they had everyone put chimneys in. This did not solve the tuberculosis problem. They still had tuberculosis. But no one stopped to ask why these isolated islanders living in these smoke-filled cottages did not get tuberculosis. It was because their diets were so rich in nutrients that they were protected even from the stress of breathing in smoke all day long. All day and all night long. We'll come back to this subject of smoke because smoke is full of dioxins. And dioxins are not something that's new to the human environment. We have actually had more exposure to dioxins in the past when we used fires for warmth and to cook our food. And the body actually has a mechanism to deal with dioxins, which we'll talk about. Dr. Price then went to Alaska. He went out into the isolated villages away from the coastline so he could study the the Alaskans who were living as their ancestors lived. Here he found a very high degree of physical perfection, beautiful broad faces, naturally straight teeth, very strong, sturdy babies. He noted that the babies were curious, they were alert, and they never cried. This was an observation he made in these cultures. He did not hear crying babies in cultures where the people were well nourished. When babies cry, it means they're hungry. It means they're hungry for nutrients, that something in them is not being satisfied, is not being fed. He found virtually no cavities among these people. And in speaking to a doctor who had lived with the Eskimos for 30 years, he learned that there had never been observed by this doctor a case of cancer, heart disease, tuberculosis, or any condition requiring an operation among those who ate their ancestral foods. Among the Eskimos who were eating the displacing foods of modern commerce, he found all of the diseases of the Western world. Here is another page from his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. He calls these primitive Eskimos, and when he uses the word primitive, he's using it as a compliment. This is the amazing thing about Dr. Price. He was in awe of the wisdom that they exercised in choosing their foods, and he believed that we had a lot to learn from the traditional people. This was in sharp contrast to the attitude of most Westerners, who believed that we had nothing to learn from these people, that it was all one way. We were bringing civilization to all of these primitive places, and that we had nothing to learn from them. Dr. Price's view was just the opposite. He believed, and he wrote in his book, that if we do not learn from these people the secrets of how to have a healthy diet, we would actually die out as a civilization. Now, many of the Eskimos had worn down teeth or even missing teeth because they chewed on leather to make their clothes and encountered grit and grains of sand. But even the worn down teeth were not decayed. There was virtually no tooth decay among the primitive Eskimos, and as you can see, very good development of the face and the dental palate. The contrast with what he found in the villages where there were trading posts and food coming in was tragic. Tremendous tooth decay. You can imagine the suffering this caused, and this once very happy, optimistic people became prone to suicide. And the only reason given for suicide was the pain of tooth decay. They developed all of our diseases, and then in the next generation, the generation who was born after they started eating the Western foods, they had changes in the facial structure. They had more narrow faces and dental deformities, overbites, underbites. And he noted that the children coming along with these dental deformities had more health problems. They were much more prone to both chronic and infectious disease. Well, let's go back a minute and look at the foods of the healthy Eskimos. What were these people eating? And here we have a very different diet once again. The main source of calories in the Eskimo diet was seal oil, an animal fat. They're carrying it here actually in the stomach of the animal. They've made a bag of the stomach, and that is seal oil. And the seal oil was used for cooking, for food preservation. They preserved foods in the seal oil. It was used for a dressing on their foods. They had a special kind of Eskimo icing where they beat the seal oil till it was frothy, and then added a few berries or a few fish eggs for a fish egg ice cream, and that was and that was for special occasions like birthdays. Naturally, the Eskimos ate a lot of fish, and many times the fish were prepared by a process of fermentation. They were actually thrown into a hole and allowed to ferment for maybe several weeks until they became soft and sort of like soft cheese, actually. And they also ate lots of game. They had one food combining rule, which was that they never ate lean meat. When they killed a marine animal or a land mammal, they first of all ate the fatty organ meats. They took all the lean meat and cut it in strips and dried it or smoked it, and they saved all of the fat from the animal. The inside fat, the cavity fat, the fat along the back, and that was rendered and saved, and when they ate the lean meat, they spread it with the fat. They even cut the liver into strips and dried and smoked the liver and spread the liver with the fat. So they never ate lean meat. This is a food combining rule that you find all over the world among so-called primitive peoples. Going back to the fish, again, the fermented fish. The reason that they ate fermented fish is that they noticed when they fed their dogs fresh fish, the dogs could not pull the sleds all day long. But if they fed fermented fish to the dogs had the stamina to pull the sleds all day long. So these people were very observant of what animals did, and they figured if this was good for the dogs, it was good for humans. And so they ate the fermented fish to give them strength and stamina. And we'll look into this later on today about why it is that fermented foods do give us so much strength and stamina. The sacred food among the Eskimos was salmon eggs. They had put the salmon eggs in the sun to dry so they would have them throughout the year. And when he asked them why they went to such trouble to preserve these salmon eggs, they said to him, "We need these salmon eggs to have healthy babies." So that was their sacred food. No fish was ever eaten without also eating the roe or the eggs in the fish. Dr. Price spent quite a bit of time with Native Americans. Now, these are not his photographs. These are some famous photographs of Native Americans. They were strikingly handsome people before they came in contact with the West, with beautiful facial structure. This is a Navajo. And the first people in the New World were in awe of the magnificent body structure of the Native Americans. The Indians in Texas, for example, were described as on average over 7 feet tall. They never wore clothes, not even in the cold weather. When the ice formed on the ponds, it was a lot of fun for them to get up in the morning and break the ice and go swimming in the ponds. You know, the Indians did not have horses before the white man came, and they hunted on foot. And so swift were they, and they had so much stamina that they were able to outrun deer and buffalo. They hunted on foot. What a change there has been with several generations of Western foods. These are photographs of Dr. Price taken in northern Canada. These were some isolated Native Americans. He found no tooth decay, no dental deformities, very good facial structure, no signs of any disease. And they lived mostly off game animals like the moose and the elk. And once again, they had this food combining rule. They never ate lean meat. They hunted animals during the season when they were the fattest, and they hunted the older animals because the older animals had more fat on them. The contrast between the modernized Native Americans was once again tragic. Those living on the reservation suffered from tremendous tooth decay, and then the next generation had the altered facial structure. Not enough room in the jaw for the teeth to come in straight. These are Seminole Indians in the Florida Everglades, and they were very shy, and it took them about 2 weeks to grant permission for the photographs. Dr. Price had to sit around and twiddle his thumbs for a couple of weeks while the elders debated this. And we're so glad that they did give permission, because you can see from these photographs what splendid, magnificent people they were. There's just nobility in every face in these Native Americans fed on traditional foods, traditional nutrient-dense foods. You can see the very good facial construction, naturally straight teeth in every member of the tribe, and no tooth decay. When you see facial structure like this, what you're seeing is the full expression of the genetic potential. We all have a blueprint for our bodies, and that blueprint is the genetics. And the genetics of every one of us is to have a strong, sturdy, and attractive body with naturally straight teeth. That is your genetic blueprint. Whether or not the body is built according to that blueprint depends on the building materials, and the building materials are the foods. So if you want to think that the genetics comes from the Creator, our health is actually a partnership with the Creator. The genetics are given to us But our job is to make sure that the growing child has the right building materials, the right types of foods. And the teeth tell the tale. When we see a person with the good bone structure and the well-formed jaw and straight teeth, that means that everything has been properly constructed in the body. It means that there'll be plenty of room in the head for the very important organs there, the pituitary, pineal, and hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, by the way, is the seat of impulse control. So there'll be a lot of willpower in people who have this good facial construction. Whereas if you see the crowded teeth, it's a sign that there's going to be some compromise in the head for all of these master glands. If the teeth are straight and well constructed, that means all of the muscles and tendons will be developed to their optimal potential. Whereas someone with crooked and crowded teeth will likely have poor development, poor posture, and will be easily injured. The native people had very keen eyesight and hearing. One of the first things that goes when we start eating processed foods is that keen eyesight and hearing, and suddenly everyone needs corrective lenses. You'll see the optimal function of all of the organs, the lungs, the kidneys, the liver, whereas there might be compromised function when you have the compromised dental development. People who are raised on nutrient-dense diets and have the good skeletal development tend to have an optimistic outlook on life. They learn easily, whereas once you start getting this compromise in the development of the body, the brain is an organ as well, and you start seeing things like depression, behavior problems, and learning disabilities. And finally, when you see that beautiful round face and the nice straight teeth, that means that the pelvic opening is round and childbirth is easy and painless. When you have the more narrow face, then the pelvic opening becomes oval or elliptical, and childbirth becomes painful and very difficult. Now let's compare our beautiful Seminole Indian princess here, brought up on traditional foods, which would include fish, game, reptiles, plenty of fat, of course, in the diet, lots of organ meats, with someone from her same tribe who was born after the parents changed their diet. This is the same genetics, it's the same blueprint for the body, but different building materials. She has crowded teeth. That's a sign that there's going to be a compromise in the entire body and the way that it was built. And this is not a hereditary problem. The genetics have not changed here. This is a nutritional problem. This is a problem with the building materials. You don't have the strength of materials in this body to have the nice wide facial structure. Dr. Price then went to the South Seas. He made a point of going to islands where there was very little contact with the outside world. And this is my favorite page from his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. Look at these beautiful smiles. You know, Dr. Price is accused of being unscientific, of, he's outdated. Well, we've learned a lot since then, and it's not healthy to eat the kind of diet that he recommends. And we hear a lot of things like that about Dr. Price. But when you look at these pictures, you realize that we don't see this type of facial structure anymore. He's captured something very valuable for us, what healthy people look like. And these are teenage boys. I want to point out, our teenage boys don't look like this, do they? They don't look this happy and optimistic. These are women from the island. He noted that all the men look like brothers and all the women look like sisters, even if they were not related. That cuts down on the jealousy factor in these cultures. And this beautiful lady here is 90 years old. When you have that excellent facial structure and the good diet throughout life, you age very gracefully. We will never know the average lifespan of these people because records were not kept. And certainly there was a lot of trauma in their life. Their lives were dangerous. People were injured and died in that way. But nevertheless, there were plenty of elderly people who had very important roles in these societies. So, what's this diet like? What is the diet of the South Seas like? And it's a much more interesting diet. We're in the tropics now. There's plenty of fruits and vegetables in the diet, lots of plant foods. There's coconut, which is actually a type of fruit, a very oily fruit. They had the taro root, so they had a lot of carbohydrates in the diet that we haven't seen before. Interestingly enough, the taro root was prepared by fermentation. They dug a hole and threw in the taro roots and let them ferment for 2 weeks, just like the bread was allowed to be cured for 2 weeks. Nevertheless, the basis of the diet was animal foods, especially foods from the sea. We see the octopus, the crab, shellfish, any type of fish. Shark was a very important food in the diet. And when they had caught a fish or shellfish, they ate the whole animal. They ate the eggs, they ate the organ meats. There's a kind of yellow goop inside that crab, which is extremely nutritious. That was eaten. Then they took the shell and ground up the shell and added it to some other foods for calcium. They had pigs on the island. The pigs were roasted in underground ovens, and they ate the whole animal, including the organ meats, the skin, the bones, and the fat. And this young man with his wonderful facial structure is having a snack, which he did not get from a vending machine. He's eating a delicious fatty sea worm. The sacred food among these islanders was the shark liver. They went to considerable risk to catch the shark. They didn't need shark, they had plenty of food. But they went on these very dangerous shark hunting expeditions because to get these nutrient-dense parts of the shark. The men ate the male organs of the shark and the women ate the female organs of the shark. So you also find in many of these cultures there are specific foods for men and women. These islands where they were on their traditional foods were like a paradise. We've had many writers talk about this. Herman Melville went and lived among these islanders. Gauguin went back and lived among the islanders. The people were cheerful and pleasant and beautiful. When they switched to the Western diet, this is what happened. The tremendous tooth decay, and then in the next generation, the altered facial structure, the narrowing of the face. And the other thing that's disappeared is that beautiful, optimistic smile. This is what modern young people look like today. Very often they have an expression on their face as if they feel like they've been cheated. They might not be able to put it into words, but there's a sense that they've been had. And they have been cheated. They've been cheated of their birthright of physical perfection, which is the birthright of every human being born onto this planet. Whether that birthright is achieved is the duty and the responsibility of the people who've come before them. These photographs were taken in a tuberculosis ward in Hawaii. Every single child in the ward had dental deformities. Now, the dental deformities were not the cause of their tuberculosis. The same conditions that prevented the optimal expression of their genetics also made them very susceptible to these diseases. Dr. Price went to Australia. Very high degree of physical perfection, very keen eyesight and hearing, very strong limber people living on traditional foods. This was a fascinating diet with lots of variety. They had legumes and grains which were prepared with great care. Usually the legumes and grains were put in baskets in running water for 2 weeks before they were then roasted and prepared into food. The basis of the diet was animal foods, birds, fish, sea mammals, kangaroo, game animals, and they also valued an insect called the witchetty grub, which was about 6 inches long and very full of fat. Once again, they were looking for the fat in their animal foods. These are Aboriginal women. They've never been to the dentist. They've never used a toothbrush, and yet their teeth are so perfect. They look like false teeth. And you can see the contrast between an Aboriginal woman on traditional foods and those who've gone into the towns and started eating the so-called civilized diet. The tooth decay, and then the next generation, the altered facial structure. Dr. Price referred to this as the underdevelopment of the middle third of the face. This is the first part of the body that's affected by the change in diet. Dr. Price went to Africa. He went into the interior of Africa and to places where few white men had been before, and he could not get over what he found in Africa. In Africa, he found 7 tribes with 100 or more people in every tribe, and not a single cavity. Over 700 individuals and no cavities. He found no dental deformities, no signs of any disease, including the diseases that we associate with Africa. As long as they were on their traditional diet, they were completely immune to the ravages of the displacing diet of modern commerce. Now, his African experience allowed him to compare 3 diets practiced by the same racial group. The first were the herders, the people who kept cattle and goats. They had a diet that was almost exclusively animal food. Their diet consisted of milk, meat, and blood. It was a very high-fat diet. The warriors drank up to 1.5 gallons of raw milk, usually fermented raw milk every day, and that gave them the equivalent of 3 sticks of butter a day, 3/4 of a pound of butter per day. These people were very slender and had no signs of heart disease and very low cholesterol. The second group were the hunter-gatherers. They did not keep animals, but they hunted and fished. They also ate a variety of plant foods, and they had a sacred food, which was liver, which was eaten both raw and cooked. The third group were the agriculturalists. They did not keep animals, they did not hunt, but they grew corn, beans, and squash. They were not vegans, however, because about 10% of their diet was insects, especially termites. It was a very important food in their diet. So when he compared these 3 groups, the first 2, the ones with a lot of animal foods in the diet, had no cavities. The agriculturalists had about 6% tooth decay. Now, this was a completely natural diet, but very lean on the animal foods, and they did suffer from tooth decay. They also tended to be shorter, a little bit overweight, and not as robust as the hunter-gatherers or the people who kept flocks of cattle and goats. Comparing the first 2 groups, as I said, neither of these groups suffered from tooth decay, but the group that had the mixed diet, the hunter-gatherers who had both animal and plant foods, they were not as tall, but they were much stronger, and they had better proportions. So one of the lessons of his African experience was that the ideal diet avoids the extreme, not too much animal food and not too much plant food, somewhere in the middle, a balance between animal and plant foods. Here's a Maasai warrior. These are the milk-drinking people. They tended to be very tall and slender. But no matter which diet they started out on, none of these groups was immune to the ravages of these displacing foods. When they came in contact with the West and started imitating the white man and eating his foods, this is what happened. Tremendous tooth decay. The difference is that they didn't have dentists. We have dentists to repair the damage. We have doctors to repair the damage. And we want to be very grateful for these miracles of modern dentistry and modern medicine. But there's only so much that the dentists and the doctors can repair. And we've actually come to the point in our civilization, especially with this next generation, where there's just not much that the medical profession can do. And then the next generation, he saw this same pattern in every race that he studied, everywhere in the world that he went. The children born to parents who had begun eating Western foods had the change in facial structure, the narrowing of the face, the underdevelopment of the middle third of the face, and they were much more susceptible to the modern diseases. This photograph perfectly illustrates the difference between a face that's constructed with good building materials. This is good facial development. You can see there's a very broad, strong palate. This part of the face is very well developed. Whereas this face is a typical modern face. There's not as much strength in the cheekbones and the dental palate, so it has to be more narrow. It almost looks as though this face is hanging from the skull. And that's adaptation that the body makes. In order to survive, the body just uh, becomes constructed more narrowly when the building materials are not good. So here we can see this difference in these dental casts made by Dr. Price. This is the cast of a primitive person, and this is a modern adult. Here you see in the front view. And I've put some architectural drawings here just to make to carry this analogy one step further. You cannot build a strong, wide arch unless you have very strong building materials. So what you see here is beauty, strength, and order. And what you see here is weakness, chaos, what Dr. Price referred to as physical degeneration. There was a doctor named Pottenger who did a study with cats over a number of years, over 900 cats, and he gave us groups of these cats a bad diet, a diet that was inappropriate for the cats. And the same thing happened to the cats that Dr. Price observed in the people. They're in the next generation, their heads were more narrow. They had weaker bones. They had more disease. They developed changes in behavior. The females became aggressive. The males became docile. They did not live harmoniously together. And as he continued feeding them this poor diet, he got to the point where there were no more cats. After 3 generations, either the young cats did not reach adulthood or the adults did not breed. So we are actually in a very serious situation here. We're seeing exactly what Dr. Price predicted, increasing disease in our young people and increasing infertility. By some accounts, 1 couple in 4 today cannot get pregnant. It's a very heartbreaking situation. We have this growing industry of fertility clinics, and you had no such problems among these traditional cultures. This is what the typical orthodontist is seeing today, all of these dental deformities. A good orthodontist can correct these, but he can't correct all of the other things that were malformed in the body. And of course, the orthodontist will say that this is due to thumb sucking or it's just genetics. They don't want to admit that this is a nutritional problem. The first bone that is affected when the diet is poor is this bone here. It's called the maxilla. It's the upper jaw bone. And almost every other bone in the head connects to the maxilla. Here is a rear view. Oh, here's the maxilla. And then you have this very interesting bone called the sphenoid, which is like a butterfly. It has these wings that stick out. And this has to be a strong bone to have a broad face. There are also little depressions in here for the organs, the glands, hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the pineal gland. And if the face is broad, there'll be a very nice broad space for those glands to live in. Well, I'd like to finish this rather lengthy introduction on Dr. Price with a few photographs of my own. This is an American woman. She was born in the South in the 1920s, a beautiful facial structure, naturally straight teeth, and she didn't grow up on sea worms or cod's head stuffed with chopped cod's liver, things that would be very difficult to get your children to eat, I know. She grew up on foods that are familiar to us. She grew up on whole, raw Jersey milk, lots of seafood in her diet. She they had plenty of meat in the diet, beef, chicken, and lamb, lots of chicken broth. Organ meats, they ate liver. Very typical food in the diet was fish eggs. Shad roe was a traditional food for them. They lived on the water and they ate lots of shellfish. And whole grains, fresh fruit, and fresh vegetables. And that's the type of diet that she grew up on, and that is the typical type of facial construction that we saw in the early part of the century. This gentleman grew up on a farm in eastern Texas. He has a very broad face. You can see the distance between the outside of the eye and the outside of the head on both sides. That's a very round face. He was basically an orphan. He grew up on his grandfather's farm. He said, the animals were my mother. he suckled directly from the goat, and actually the mule was his mother also. He said if I got a crawdad from the stream, I had to eat it right away because otherwise someone else would get it. So he ate the crawdads raw, and he said my grandfather treated me very poorly, and I got all the leavings, all the pieces of meat that no one else would eat. And so he ended up eating a lot of organ meats for that reason. He said, I didn't realize how strong I was until I went into the army, and he said I could whoop those soldiers twice my size. He's still going strong in his 90s after a very colorful career as a bootlegger and a card sharp. A very keen mind. He said he could take an unmarked deck of cards and mark them up very skillfully, and within 10 minutes he knew every card in the deck from the back. This is a Canadian woman, Agnes MacPhail. Look at her beautiful bone structure. Now this will be a more narrow face. The Gaelic face is genetically more narrow, but this is excellent bone structure. She grew up on a dairy farm. She was a great champion of women's rights and a great reformer in Canada. Here's a rock group from the 50s. Freddie Lyman and the Teenagers. I was really struck by this photograph because every one of these young men has naturally straight teeth. Now you cannot go into a high school today and find 5 young men with naturally straight teeth like this. This type of facial construction has disappeared in America for Americans born here. And these young men did not have their teeth straightened. This is natural. They probably grew up on farms, had access to raw milk, and probably lots of organ meats. Lots of good farm food. We compare them with the Temptations. A generation later, they may have had their teeth straightened and whitened, but can you see the difference in facial structure? You see a narrowing, you see a slightly slunken in look there in the middle third of the face. That's what Dr. Price refers to as physical degeneration. And we know that if the diet that causes this type of change in the physical structure is continued for another generation or two, you end up with no people. Reproduction ceases, or the young people do not reach adulthood. And that's what we're starting to see today. On this man's face, who's the only one with a narrow face in this whole photograph from 1910. As you can see, beautiful bone structure. These are Native Americans. These are the white people. Everyone has beautiful high cheekbones. The Native Americans would have been eating buffalo guts and all sorts of foods that we don't like to eat. But the Americans, the white Americans, would be eating raw milk, raw dairy products, lots of organ meats, liver, and so forth. Nothing was wasted in those days. Now, if you took that picture today, even if it was a photograph of athletes, you would see the opposite. You'd see 1 or 2 with the good facial structure. That would be the exception to the rule, and everyone else with the compromised facial development. Here's a famous person, Elvis Presley. Look at the father's face. What a beautiful, broad face he has. And the mother also. Now, Elvis was very handsome, but you can see that there's a narrowing of the face there. And I think some of that sense of loss is reflected in his music, actually, and that's why it was so popular. Not only did he have a beautiful voice, but there's a sense of loss reflected in what he was singing. This is normal facial development in these South American children from a poor village. We would call them deprived, and yet they're supremely blessed with their birthright of physical perfection. They'll be eating insects, maybe some raw goat milk. Nothing is wasted when they butcher an animal, so they eat the organ meats. Contrasted with what we're seeing in our children today, with each generation you get the more serious changes in the facial structure. Narrow faces, they almost all need braces to straighten their teeth, and they're plagued with allergies, asthma, learning disabilities, behavior problems, autism, even diseases that we associated with adults, such as cancer and arthritis. The narrow face has become so commonplace that we're seeing it in the fashion magazines today. If this is where you ended up And it's certainly where I ended up. I needed braces, and I had lots of health problems as a young woman. I have a much more narrow face than my parents, who both have naturally straight teeth. Don't despair, because the dietary principles that we're going to present to you today can give you good health, even if you're living in a bungalow instead of a palace. And that's what I consider I'm living in. The good news is that this trend is reversible. If pregnant women know how to eat, if they know how to feed their developing children, we can reverse this trend. This beautiful young woman was born to a mother who had a facial narrow face and crowded and crooked teeth. She had some health problems as a young woman. But when she was a teenager, by chance, she started to eat lots of liver. She often went out with her friends, and she said she couldn't afford the more expensive things on the menu, so she ended up eating liver 2 or 3 times a week. She also, at that time, moved to a place where she had access to raw milk, raw Guernsey milk. And the result was this beautiful daughter with naturally straight teeth. My own story is very similar. When I was in college, I went off to France to learn to speak French, and when I was in France, I discovered a food that I had never tasted before, and that food was liver pâté. And my first taste of liver pâté, it was like my body saying, "At last, at last you found what you've been needing." And I actually made quite a pig of myself in France and ate liver pâté morning, noon, and night. But and tried to find it when I came home because I loved it so much. And I was blessed, my first child. This was long before I learned about these principles, just by chance. She has naturally straight teeth and didn't have the health problems that I had as a young woman. So the situation is reversible, and here are some of our beautiful Weston A. Price babies. We're thrilled to see so many young people here today because you're the ones, the young women of childbearing age, you're the ones we're depending on to make these changes so that the next generation can carry the torch for us and get back to work in making this a perfect planet. Dr. Price said, individual beauty is a matter of both design of the face and regularity and perfection of the teeth. Nature always builds harmoniously if conditions are sufficiently favorable, regardless of race, color, or location. So nature doesn't make mistakes. It's people make mistakes, and of course that's a learning process. But nature does not make mistakes. Well, by now you're probably completely confused because I said that I was going to answer this question, what is a healthy diet? And yet all of these diets were different. And a lot of people reading Dr. Price throw up their hands and say, well, all these diets were different, so there's no such thing as a healthy diet. That is the wrong conclusion to reach from Dr. Price. We see that some had lots of animal foods, some had fairly few animal foods, some had mostly cooked foods, some had mostly raw foods, some had dairy foods and some didn't, some had grains and some didn't. So how are we going to make sense out of all of these different diets and come to some kind of guidelines for ourselves? That's what we're going to do. Next, we're going to look at 11 underlying characteristics of healthy diets. Once you understand these principles, you then can take these principles and apply them to your own family, to your budget, to what's available to you, and most importantly, to what your family will actually eat. Because there's no sense trying to impose on other people foods that they don't like. And there's plenty of variety in these traditional foods that anyone can come up with a diet that's delicious. So, the first underlying characteristic, no refined or denatured foods. The list in Dr. Price's day of these food ingredients was rather short: white sugar, white flour, vegetable oils, a new invention. About 1890, the first vegetable oils coming on the scene. Canned foods and condensed milk. The list is much longer for us. Not only do we have refined sugar, we have something called high fructose corn syrup, which is actually worse than sugar. It's very harmful to growing children, growing animals in the studies, and growing children, and we will see why. White flour is actually the basis of that food pyramid that we looked at earlier. They may give lip service to whole grains, but when they're talking about 6 to 11 servings of bread, pasta, and crackers every day, you're talking about white flour. And white flour is an empty food. Pasteurized milk and skim and low-fat milk are not whole foods. They're foods in which very valuable components have either been destroyed or taken away. We'll come back to this subject as well. And then we have the new oils, hydrogenated fats, and refined vegetable oils, completely new to the human diet. And we'll be looking at these in more detail to find out exactly why they're so harmful to the human body. One thing I'm very concerned about are the protein powders, the isolated protein powders, which everybody thinks are such a great deal. They pose a very specific danger, which we will talk about in a few minutes. And finally, of course, the additives, the thousands of additives in our food. And the effect of these additives is additive. You can test 2 or 3 additives at the what's considered a safe level. They won't cause any harm to the animals in the tests. But if you put all the additives together, you end up with dead animals. So the effects of these additives are additive, even if they're all in the so-called safe dosage. Once you put a lot of them together, the effects are very harmful. Dr. Price's most famous saying is, "Life in its fullness is Mother Nature obeyed." Once again, this is a tremendous contrast to the attitude of his day and even the modern attitude, which is that we can outsmart Mother Nature, that what happens in nature happens by chance, that there's mistakes, and that human beings can do better. And the food industry honestly believes this, that they can make artificial foods and add some synthetic vitamins, and this is going to be better than what Mother Nature can do. And that's not what Dr. Price believed. He had a tremendous respect for nature, and that the idea was not to outsmart Mother Nature, but to obey Mother Nature. Factory foods are not Mother Nature's foods, and I can guarantee you, if you're eating factory foods, you will not have a full life. You will not have the type of fullness of life that we are supposed to have. Second underlying characteristic of these traditional diets, every diet contained animal products. This was Dr. Price's greatest disappointment. He had hoped to find a culture that was not eating animal products and that was healthy. And he had to admit that he didn't find such a culture. According to Dr. Price, the most important animal foods were fish and shellfish, and not just the fish fillets, but the organs, the oil, the bones, the heads, and so forth. Dr. Price not only looked at living people, but he looked at skulls, and he took calipers with him and measured the thickness of the skulls in all of these cultures. And what he found was that the cultures that ate fish and shellfish had the thickest skulls. And that's a good thing, to have a thick skull. For many reasons. Many cultures ate birds, and not just the skinless chicken breast. They ate the whole animal, including the organs. The liver was especially prized in these birds, the fat and the skin. Many cultures consumed red meat, beef, goat, sheep, game, with the organ meat and fats preferred. Nothing was thrown away. They never ate lean meat. They wanted these animals fat. Milk and milk products, eggs, reptiles, and many cultures also consumed insects. So every culture that he looked at had animal foods in the diet. There are certain nutrients that we find only in animal products. Chief among them are the nutrients that we find in the fats of the animals, vitamin A and D. We'll talk in depth about vitamins A and D shortly. Cholesterol is a nutrient for growing children. Growing children cannot make all the cholesterol they need, and they need a lot of cholesterol in their diets to form the brain and also to form the second brain. What's the second brain? The stomach and the intestinal tract. These require a lot of cholesterol to be formed properly. This is why we're seeing learning disabilities and digestive disorders go hand in hand, because both of these parts of the body need a lot of cholesterol to be formed properly. Vitamin B12 is an extremely important vitamin, and we get it only from animal products. And certain types of fats, or what we call fatty acids, arachidonic acid, EPA, and DHA, very important for neurological development. We only get those from the animal foods. Now, there's many nutrients that we find in plant foods, but they're blocked or difficult to absorb from the plant foods. And they're much more easily absorbed from the animal foods. And first among these is calcium. In traditional cultures, there really are only two good sources of calcium. One is raw dairy products, and the other is bones. And in cultures that don't have dairy products, there's a lot of use made of the bones. Perfect example is the Asian diet, where they're not using dairy, but in a traditional Asian diet, every meal will include a bone broth, and they're considered very important for their health. B6, magnesium, iron, zinc, and copper, extremely important nutrients, much more easily absorbed from the animal foods. Zinc deficiency is one of the first things that comes along in a vegan diet. It's impossible to get adequate zinc from plant foods. It's there, but it's blocked and difficult to absorb. It's bound up, it's chelated, and the body has to expend a lot of energy to extract the zinc or the copper or the iron and so forth. The best sources of zinc are shellfish and red meat, especially beef. And that's a very good reason for eating beef, is to get zinc. And zinc is very important for, once again, for mental processes. Now, B12 deficiency is a very serious condition. And if it gets too far gone, it's irreversible. You can't go back, even if you're giving a lot of B12. Early signs of deficiency include fatigue, tingling in the hands and feet, sleep disorders, and irrational anger. Someone flying off the handle all the time. You want to look into B12 deficiency. He seems angry for no reason. The psychiatric disorders associated with B12 deficiency include depression, obsessive compulsive behavior, manic depression, and dementia or Alzheimer's. One school of thought feels that most cases of Alzheimer's are actually B12 deficiency. And then the chronic diseases, multiple sclerosis, anemia, cancer, and heart disease. You don't want to put yourself in the position of becoming deficient in B12. B12 is found only in animal products. There are compounds that look like B12 in certain types of plant foods, but they're analogs, and they actually block the uptake of the true B12. Fermented soy, for example, actually increases the body's need for B12. It's very difficult to absorb B12, and as we get older, it becomes more difficult. So you often find B12 deficiencies in the elderly, as well, of course, as vegetarians. If you are a lacto-ovo-vegetarian, depending on dairy foods for your B12, you need to understand that it's almost completely destroyed by pasteurization. So the lacto-ovo-vegetarians, in my opinion, need raw milk as a religious rite. Now, the diet that we're recommending is not necessarily a diet where you go out and have a big 16-ounce steak every day. And if you don't believe in eating red meat, I'm not here to tell you that you have to eat red meat. This beautiful lady comes from a tribe in Eastern Africa where the only two foods in the diet are a type of fermented goat milk and some insects. So if you want to be a vegetarian and you can get some raw milk and insects, that's fine. And if you can't get insects, eggs contain many of the nutrients that insects contain. So some ethnic backgrounds will do fine on a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet of very good quality, raw dairy, and eggs. But if your ancestors come from seacoast regions or from cultures that ate a lot of organ meats, you may not do very well on the lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet. This is a piece of beef industry propaganda showing all the things that we use that are derived from slaughtered animals, killed cows. Not just the steak on your plate, soap. Anyone want to go without soap? Beef tallow is used to make soap. There's actually a shortage of tallow because they're making biodiesel with tallow today. Tallow is beef fat. So anyone using soap is using the products of slaughtered animals. Plastics, crayons, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, hydraulic brake fluid in airplanes. There's a product in there that comes from beef, from cows. And there's a little membrane in the telephone that vibrates when you talk that's made out of beef gelatin. So all of us are dependent on the products of slaughtered animals, whether or not you're eating meat or not. So there's no reason to take the moral high ground if you're avoiding the animal foods, because you are dependent on the products of slaughtered animals like everyone is. And more so in the past than today. We would not be here as a species if we didn't hunt and kill animals, not only for food, but for hides, for leather, for tools. We could not have survived without animals. And I think it's important to point out the origins of the modern philosophy of the high fiber, mostly vegetarian diet. Started with Sylvester Graham. And the reason that he promoted a vegetarian diet was to promote chastity and to curb lust. He preached that excessive sexual desire caused disease. And then after him came John Harvey Kelly, who was a Seventh-day Adventist who promoted a high-fiber vegetarian diet to combat the twin evils of constipation and natural urges. And he preached against sexual activity even in marriage. So these were the food Puritans. Now today we have a little bit different view about these things. We don't advocate this type of sexual Puritanism anymore, but the diet's still with us. The puritanical diet, we're still following. We've sort of forgotten why it was promoted in the first place. All right, this is the most important slide that I'm going to show you today, and this is the crux of Dr. Price's findings, and the part that most people miss when they are talking about his work. And it has to do with nutrient density. Dr. Price took these foods home to his laboratory and analyzed them for nutrient content, and he found that these traditional diets were extremely high in calcium and all of the minerals. This is where soil fertility comes in. This is why we pay a lot of attention to farming techniques at the Weston A. Price Foundation. Because if the minerals aren't in the soil, they're not going to be in their food. And this is also why seafood is important, because we know we're getting all the minerals in the seafood. But this is the really important part here, the fat-soluble vitamins. Very, very high. At least 10 times more of these fat-soluble vitamins in the traditional diet than the American diet of his day, and probably an even worse ratio today. When Dr. Price was talking about the fat-soluble vitamins, he's talking about vitamins A and D. And here's where we get these vitamins. First of all, we get them in seafoods, certain types of seafoods especially. We get them in fish eggs, very rich in A and D. Fish livers and fish liver oil, like cod liver oil. Think of the shark liver and the cod's liver in the Gaelic people. Fish heads, very rich in A and D. Certain oily fish, shellfish, are wonderful sources of A and D. And the sea mammals, like seals and seal oil, for example, very rich in vitamin A. So these are the seafoods that give us A and D. And then the land animals, certain insects, butter and cream, egg yolks, liver and organ meats, and animal fat, especially in certain types of animals, if these animals are on pasture. If they're eating green grass, they'll be good sources of vitamin A. If they're out in the sunlight, they'll be good sources of vitamin D. Now, is there anything that strikes you as odd about these lists of food? These were the sources of vitamin A and D. They were sacred foods among these cultures. They were foods that they sought out, often at very great risk. These are the foods we've been told not to eat. These are the foods that have been demonized. Our government has figured out a way to make you afraid of every one of these foods. Butter and cream, full of saturated fat. Eggs and liver, full of cholesterol. You don't want to eat those things. And liver is full of poisons. And you certainly don't want to eat animal fats. And the latest victim is the seafood. Our government is warning pregnant women not to eat seafood in the teeth of evidence showing that the mercury in seafood is not a problem for pregnant women. So these foods have been demonized. And these are the high cholesterol, high fat foods that we should be eating, that we need to eat to be healthy. And I do want to point out that many of them were sacred foods: the butter, the fish eggs, the livers, the organ meats. Egg yolks are a sacred food in China. A woman who's pregnant and nursing in China, if she can afford it, eats up to 10 eggs a day. They're considered a brain food, and she eats 10 eggs a day to make sure that her child will be intelligent. Dr. Price referred to vitamins A and D as activators because they are the catalysts for mineral absorption. You actually cannot use the minerals in your diet without these activators. You can be eating organic food and mineral drinks and all sorts of ways of getting minerals, but if you don't have these activators, the minerals go to waste. He said this is where the greatest breakdown takes place in the modern diet, in getting enough of these activating substances needed for rendering the minerals in the food available to the human system. He said it is possible to starve for minerals that are abundant in the foods eaten because they cannot be utilized without an adequate quantity of the fat-soluble activators. If we think of the body as a house or a temple, as a structure built with bricks and mortar, the bricks are the minerals and the mortar are the fat-soluble activators. And we need both to build a strong body. There's a lot of confusion and misinformation about these activators, starting with vitamin A. If you look on the back of a can of tomatoes, it'll tell you there's vitamin A in those tomatoes, and that is actually false. If you go to a biochemistry textbook or the Merck manual, you will read that there's no vitamin A in plant foods. What's in the plant foods are the precursors, the carotenes. And these are broken down in the intestines of animals and also humans to the true vitamin A. This is the true vitamin A here. And it's a procedure that actually adds oxygen. So it's a very difficult procedure that requires a lot of enzymes to complete. Now, as I said, humans can make this conversion, although we don't do it very well. To make the conversion, first of all, we need fats in the diet. So if you just eat carrots, you'll get a lot of carotenes, and the carotenes have a role to play, but they're not the fat-soluble activator, vitamin A, that's so important. And unless you put butter on those carrots or cream in your soup or cream in your carrot juice, you're not going to make any vitamin A because this process takes place in the presence of bile, and you don't produce bile unless you're eating fats. So that also makes these foods taste a lot better too if you put butter on them. Enzymes are involved. Thyroid hormone is critical to making vitamin A, and vitamin E is involved. So it's a complex process that we don't understand very well that requires a lot of nutrients from the body. Now, the key thing here to remember is that babies and children do not convert at all or very little, and they don't store vitamin A. So as a function of body weight, babies and children need more vitamin A than adults do because they don't make it, and also because they're growing, and you need vitamin A for growth. The other group that does not make vitamin A very well is diabetics. Diabetes is not just a problem of glucose metabolism. The diabetic actually cannot make a lot of these enzymes that he needs to make vitamin A. And what kind of diet do we put our diabetics on in this country? A low-fat diet. It is an absolute disaster for diabetics. It's a recipe for problems. The diabetic needs lots of vitamin A. They need a high-fat diet to regulate their blood sugar. And we actually have a diabetic in our family who's got type 1 diabetes. He's been on insulin for many years, but he's been completely able to avoid the problems that we associate with diabetes by taking cod liver oil and getting plenty of vitamin A in the diet. He said no retina problems, no kidney problems, and no healing problems. So I really think a lot of these problems are just problems of vitamin A deficiency. Many other conditions will interfere with the production of vitamin A, poor thyroid and liver function, if you have poor intestinal absorption, high intake of nitrites and nitrates, pesticides. If pesticides interfere with vitamin A, and if you're exposed to industrial pollutants, chemicals, and pesticides, you need a lot more vitamin A in your diet. And just eating a lot of carotene actually shuts down the conversion mechanism. So you can't just eat carrots and broccoli all day and think you're going to get enough vitamin A. So even under optimal conditions, plant sources of carotene cannot supply sufficient vitamin A for optimum health in humans. Vitamin A is needed not only for mineral metabolism, not only for absorbing minerals, but for using protein. Protein and vitamin A go together. What happens when you eat lean meat, which traditional cultures would never do, or egg whites without the yolks, the so-called healthy omelet, or skim milk, or protein powders? What happens? The body says, oh, protein, I need vitamin A to use this protein. And the body goes to the liver where vitamin A is stored and gets the vitamin A there to use that protein. And the quickest way to deplete yourself of vitamin A is to eat a lot of protein. We are actually not advocating a high protein diet. We advocate a certain amount of animal protein, a complete protein, but you need to be careful not to overdo. It's much more important to get the right fats and the fat-soluble activators. You need vitamin A for calcium assimilation. What happens when you drink a lot of skim milk without the fat? Body does not know what to do with this calcium. It ends up in the wrong place. It ends up in the joints. It ends up in the soft tissues like the arteries. What is atherosclerosis? What is clogging the arteries? It's not cholesterol. It's calcium that's in the arteries. And when it's very advanced, you can actually see that calcium in x-rays. Vitamin A is needed for proper growth and prevention of birth defects. When the baby is forming in the womb, stem cells, which are undifferentiated cells, become different organs. First organ to form is the heart, and then you have the liver and the stomach and the lungs and so forth. They are all created out of stem cells. And the compound that tells the stem cells what to do, that gives them their marching orders, is vitamin A. The vitamin A is what tells the stem cells what to become. If a woman gets pregnant and she has very poor vitamin A status and she's not getting vitamin A in her diet, the heart will not form properly and she'll have a miscarriage. And she needs vitamin A right through her pregnancy in order for all of those organs to form properly. And yet our government is telling women to avoid vitamin A. All of the endocrine system depends on vitamin A. You need vitamin A to make all the hormones, especially thyroid hormone. You need vitamin A to make T cells for your immune system. You need vitamin A for sex and stress hormones, and you need vitamin A for healthy eyes, skin, and bones. Interesting, we think of vitamin D for bones, but you also need vitamin A for healthy bones. We refer to cholesterol as the mother of all hormones. Cholesterol is the substance that these hormones are made out of. And here we have all the sex hormones: progesterone, DHEA, estrogen, and testosterone. They are made out of cholesterol. You think it's a good idea to be lowering people's cholesterol. We need these hormones. And over here we have the adrenal cortex hormones. These are the hormones that keep our blood sugars stable, that help us assimilate minerals, that help us deal with stress, and that help us heal. Cortisol helps us heal and deal with stress. They are made from cholesterol. But the point of this chart is that to make all of these hormones, you need vitamin A for everyone. All of these arrows represent enzymes, and these enzymes are vitamin A dependent. So you really are going to have problems with fertility and with dealing with stress and healing if you're lacking vitamin A. We'll talk about trans fats this afternoon. Trans fat inhibit all of these pathways. We've had fantastic feedback and testimonials from women with hormonal problems, for example, fibroid tumors, endometriosis, very painful menstrual periods, getting on very high dose cod liver oil. And we've had miraculous recoveries with very high dose vitamin A with these hormonal problems. A man named Hale in Texas back in the 40s carried out some experiments with pigs. He took normal pigs and mated them, and when the sows were pregnant, he removed vitamin A from the diet, and all the piglets were born blind with a petrified optic nerve. Then he took these blind pigs and mated them. A few of the sows did get pregnant, and while they were pregnant, he gave them vitamin A, and all of the blind pigs gave birth to normally sighted pigs. So this is a so-called genetic problem that is completely cured with vitamin A or caused by vitamin A deficiency. Vitamin A stores are rapidly depleted by stress, but nobody here is ever under any stress, right? We don't have to worry about that one. When you're under a lot of stress, you need more vitamin A, and if you have very good vitamin A status, you can deal with stress. Stress is actually exhilarating. It's a wonderful challenge. When vitamin A status is depleted, then every little thing is going to be stressful for you. Too much protein, a very quick way to deplete yourself of vitamin A. Cold weather depletes vitamin A. Fever and illness. It's important for children to have fevers. Fevers stimulate the immune system, but fevers also use up vitamin A. So when a child does have a fever, you make sure you're giving them cod liver oil with an eyedropper, that they get smoothies made out of egg yolks and cream, a little liver pate. Make sure you're keeping that vitamin A status full, because otherwise you sometimes get blindness after a fever. Physical exertion depletes vitamin A, and exposure to toxins. So if you are in an industry or a job, or your neighbor next door is spraying pesticides and they're carried over onto your farm, you need to double your dose of cod liver oil. Make sure you're getting plenty of vitamin A. Dioxins deplete vitamin A. Dioxins are in smoke. They're in modern pesticides, many modern components. There are almost 80 scientific papers on this subject. People on traditional diets seem to be completely protected against dioxins. We look at the Japanese fish eaters, getting lots of dioxins, lots of exposure, but do not have high levels in the blood. And here's a good reason to eat your vegetables, besides the fact that vegetables are a great vehicle for butter, is is that they prevent the absorption of dioxin in the intestinal tract. So, you know, we live in a toxic world, and we of course need to clean up that toxic world. But we don't want to be so paranoid about toxins that we can't function in this world. So the other half of the equation is protecting yourself as much as you can with the right type of diet. Then we have the vitamin D myth. And the vitamin D myth is that all we need to do is to get adequate vitamin D is just go outside in the sunlight, expose your hands and face for about 10 minutes every day, and you'll get all the vitamin D you need. We now know that this is completely false. You only make vitamin D when the sunlight is directly overhead. When you get UVB light, that's when the sunlight is directly overhead. And in this part of the world, that only happens at midday in the summer months. And if you want to go out and sunbathe with nothing on at that time of day, I think it's a wonderful idea. For most of us, this is very impractical, and it's impossible for us to make vitamin D most of the year. We just don't have the right type of angle in the sunlight. So we need to get vitamin D from our food. And all healthy primitive groups, including those living in the tropics, had rich dietary sources of vitamin D. Fish liver oils, shellfish, insects, butterfat and egg yolks of animals on pasture in the sunlight, organ meats. Bird fat is a very good source, and the fat of pigs, which is lard. Pigs make vitamin D the way humans do and store it in their fat. So that's an excellent source of vitamin D. Vitamin D has many roles, just like vitamin A. It's critical for healthy bones and proper growth, for mineral metabolism. Bodybuilders, vitamin D is critical for good muscle tone, important for reproduction and healthy skin. The interesting thing here is the insulin production. You need vitamin D to make insulin. And there was a study carried out in Sweden where they put one group of babies on cod liver oil for the first year of life. And they had a control group that did not get cod liver oil, and then they followed them into adulthood. The control group developed diabetes at the rate of the general population. Not a single child who had been given cod liver oil in the first year of life developed diabetes. And they were given no special dietary instruction. Both groups had similar diets. So they were protected. They obviously built a good, strong, healthy pancreas in that first year of life with adequate vitamin D. Vitamin D is necessary for the immune system, nervous system, cell function, feel-good chemicals in the brain, longevity. High vitamin D status is associated with longevity. Beware of the synthetic vitamin D. That's the vitamin D2, which is made from vegetarian sources. Often has the opposite effect of the animal type of vitamin D. Like so many of the synthetic vitamins, usually it can be harmful rather than helpful. So the synthetic vitamin D causes softening of the hard tissues like the bones and hardening of the soft tissues, such as the organs and the arteries. And the synthetic vitamin D is added to the vegetarian beverages, soy milk, oat milk, rice milk, and almond milk. So it's a very good reason to avoid these processed foods. Well, it's sort of been drummed into our heads that vitamin A and D are toxic. And people avoid them because they think that they are toxic. And we've had our researchers look into this. And what we have found out is that, like so many things in nature, vitamin A and D work together. If you're getting a lot of vitamin A without the vitamin D, the vitamin A can be toxic. And vice versa, if you're getting the vitamin D without the vitamin A, the vitamin D can be toxic. What we found is that if you get about 1,000 units of vitamin D per day, vitamin A is not toxic in the millions of units at any dose. So you need that base level of 1,000 units of vitamin D per day. The notion that vitamin A is toxic came from studies carried out in Scandinavia where they add vitamin A to the milk. And these vitamin D intakes are very low, and the women developed osteoporosis who were drinking a lot of this vitamin A fortified milk. But when the vitamin D is there, the vitamin A is not toxic. So when you buy your cod liver oil, the ratio should be 10 to 1, 10 A to 1 D. And many brands of cod liver oil contain almost no vitamin D. So you need to be careful and follow our guidelines in purchasing cod liver oil. We're very keen on the high vitamin cod liver oil, which has a very high dose of vitamin A and D. And we have certain recommended suppliers of this wonderful food. And I want to stress that cod liver oil is a food. It's not a vitamin, but it's a nutrient-dense food. These are modern Africans. And I'm always so inspired when I see Africans who grew up in Africa. We have a lot of Africans in Washington, D.C., and I'm an embarrassment to my children because I will stop these people on the street and say, you have such beautiful teeth. What did you eat when you were growing up? And usually they talk about, we had different types we had bananas, we had peanuts, we had beans, we had fufu, which is cassava. No, what kind of meat did you eat? We never ate meat. We were too poor to eat meat. Well, what types of animal foods did you eat? And they talk about frogs, insects, shrimp, a little dried fish, and so forth. Very low in animal foods, but obviously still a good diet because they have this wonderful bone structure. These are two very typical foods in Africa. This is palm oil. It's a highly saturated fat. It will be liquid in the tropics, but this is the oil that they typically use. Very rich in carotene, so they'll be able to make some vitamin A from this. But this is the really key food. It's a jar of shrimp paste. Shrimp paste is a condiment. It's used like ketchup. Almost every African I talk to talks with great affection about shrimp paste. I don't think you'd talk about shrimp paste with much affection because it's definitely an acquired taste. Very fishy. It's made with fermented dried shrimp. And when I went back to the food tables and looked up shrimp, I was flabbergasted to see how rich in vitamin D shrimp is. So this is a low-protein food, very rich in minerals, very rich in calcium, and extremely rich in vitamin D. And it's adequate for them. They don't need a lot of animal foods when the animal foods they're eating are so rich in nutrients. Here's a couple more typical African foods. These are dried worms. And these are little dried fish with the head and everything, and these will be put in soups and stews. The fish in particular will be a very rich source of vitamin A. So very often people say, oh, the Weston A price, this is the high-protein, low-carb diet. But these Africans were eating a low-protein, high-carb diet, and they were perfectly healthy. But the types of animal foods that they were eating were very different from the types of animal foods that we eat. And I think you'd have a hard time getting your children to eat these foods. Although we're really interested in the little salted dried fish. This is a typical snack for children in Asia, extremely healthy, and we'd like someone to start importing these fish. I think if you introduce them to children at a young enough age that they would actually eat them. They're crunchy, and salty, like a potato chip or something. So where did we get the activators in the American diet? We were not eating worms and shrimp paste. We got them from dairy foods. And up until the Second World War, our dairy foods were all from pastured animals. Butter, cream, cheese, eggs from pastured chickens. We weren't afraid of these foods. We recognized them as healthy. And up until the Second World War, almost every child in this country got cod liver oil. We had an excellent diet up till about 1940 in this country. We weren't afraid of these foods, and we had them in abundance. We also ate organ meats. It was typical to eat liver once a week, and the organ meats were also hidden in other foods, in sausage and scrapple and liverwurst and so forth, Braunschweiger and these types of foods. So it was typical to eat liver several times a week. That's a good diet. And then all the other things are sort of peripheral if you have this base in your diet. Now we're told to eat skinless chicken breasts. In 100 grams of a skinless chicken breast, there'll be only 21 international units of vitamin A. So that's really quite dangerous. That's a very high protein, low vitamin A food. If you eat the skin, which we're told not to eat, you'll get 83 units of vitamin A. If you eat the skinless dark meat, you only get 72, but if you eat the dark meat with the skin, you'll get 201 units. And if you eat the livers, you get 13,000 units of vitamin A. And believe me, that vitamin A will help you deal with the poisons and the pesticides and so forth that are in the food. We also cooked in lard. Lard is a fantastic source of vitamin D. And the people I know who grew up on lard have beautiful skin and lovely dispositions. Here's an old ad for lard. They're happy because they eat lard. But it's true. We need the vitamin D to make neurochemicals that protect against depression. The feel-good chemicals require vitamin D to be processed and used in the body. Okay. Before we finish this topic on the fat-soluble activators, I want to talk about one other activator that Dr. Price, he actually discovered this activator. He called it Activator X. He never could figure out what it was. But it was found in these sacred foods and seemed to be very important for the growth of children and very curative. The basis seems to be something in green-growing plants that the animals transform into this activator and store in their fats. And all healthy primitive groups had this price factor or Activator X. Well, once again, we put our researchers on this, and we think we've figured out what the Activator X is. We think that it is the animal form of vitamin K, which is vitamin K2. It's formed from vitamin K1, which is in the green plants. So that ties in very well. It's very important for growth, especially in facial development. You can actually read that a symptom of vitamin K deficiency is underdevelopment of the middle third of the face. That's actually in the literature. You need vitamin K to use phosphorus and calcium in the bones and teeth. This is the really fascinating one. Vitamin K prevents calcification and inflammation of the arteries, coronary artery disease. And the Dutch researchers who are looking into vitamin K are predicting that within 10 years we will define heart disease as a vitamin K deficiency condition. And yet everyone's telling us not to eat the sources of vitamin K. Vitamin K is involved in the synthesis of the myelin sheath in the nervous system and supports learning capacity, and it's vital for normal reproduction. What we've found is that like A and D are a synergy, so is vitamin K involved. They all work together. Vitamins A and D tell the cells to make certain proteins, and then vitamin K activates those proteins after the signaling by vitamin A and D. So once again, we get this fantastic synergy in nature, and the types of foods that contain A and D also tend to be good sources of vitamin K. Tested sources. Well, this is not an animal food. This is a soy food, actually, a fermented soy food called natto. Vitamin K is actually formed by fermentation in the guts of animals from the K1, excuse me. But before you rush out and buy some natto, just let me warn you that this is definitely an acquired taste. And in the Japanese restaurants where they serve natto, they have a special room for the natto eaters because it smells so awful. So I think I'd rather get my vitamin K from the next best source, which is goose liver pate. And I go back to thinking about my college days and how I ate all of this goose liver pate and was blessed with a beautiful daughter with naturally straight teeth. Cheese is an excellent source. Cheese from grass-fed animals, because not only are the animals making the vitamin K2, but it's formed during the fermentation process. Egg yolks, butter, chicken liver, fatty meats, and sauerkraut is also a source. But these are the animal sources, the foods we're being told not to eat. Foods that haven't been tested but that are probable sources, chicken, duck, and goose fat, that crustacean butter, the yellow goop inside the shellfish. Bone marrow we think is a good source. Other organ meats, fish eggs, and the fermented cod liver oil, which is now available. We're looking forward to doing more research on vitamin K. This was one of Dr. Price's favorite photographs, this darling little Peruvian girl. She's a beautiful round face. She lives at 12,000 feet in the Andes, and she's holding a sacred food here, which is dried fish eggs. And when he asked them why they went to such trouble to carry these fish eggs up from the seacoast up to 12,000 feet, he found them in everybody's backpacks. They said, oh, we need these fish eggs so we can have healthy babies. Like the Eskimos, thousands of miles away, how did they know that these foods were so important? They had an instinct that we have lost. And we have to come to this through science. And fortunately, science completely validates these traditions. These fish eggs would be rich in Activator X, vitamins A and D, zinc, iodine, special fatty acids, all necessary for healthy reproduction. The combination that Dr. Price used in his practice to provide the fat-soluble activators, A, D, and Activator X, which we now know as vitamin K2, was the high vitamin cod liver oil and what he called high vitamin butter oil, which was made by centrifuging the butter from cows eating rapidly growing green grass and making an oil out of it. And the vitamins concentrated in the oil. And we think that the reason this combination was so magic was that there was only A and D in the cod liver oil. When he added the butter oil, they got the vitamin K. And he literally brought people back from the brink of death with this combination. He cured tooth decay. He reversed tooth decay with this combination of foods. He helped with growth, arthritis. He even cured a case of epilepsy with the combination of high vitamin butter oil and high vitamin cod liver oil. Now the butter oil is expensive. You can imagine it takes about 16 gallons of milk to make 16 ounces of butter oil. So if you don't want to use the butter oil, we certainly suggest when you're using the cod liver oil to make sure you have other sources of vitamin K in the diet, such as butter, goose liver pate, fish eggs, so forth. How much cod liver oil should we take? You want to take a dose of cod liver oil that gives you at least 10,000 international units of vitamin A per day and 1,000 units of vitamin D. That's your base requirement there. And that comes from 1 teaspoon of high vitamin cod liver oil or 2 teaspoons of regular cod liver oil. And please only use our recommended brands. These are on our website and also in our shopping guide. For pregnancy and lactation, you can double that. If you're recovering from illness or surgery, you can go much higher, as long as you've got this vitamin D in the diet. And babies and children should get cod liver oil to supply 5,000 units of vitamin A and at least 500 of vitamin D. Well, how do you take this stuff? That's the real challenge. Never give it on a spoon. Okay. Mix your cod liver oil with a little fresh orange juice, a little cream, a little milk, or a little water. Stir fast down the hatch. Okay, it's very easy to take that way, and give it to babies with an eyedropper. Before 1950, books on infant feeding recommended 2 teaspoons of cod liver oil for babies 3 months and older. We recommend consuming it with butter from grass-fed cows to get the vitamin A, but also to get the saturated fats, because cod liver oil is very unsaturated, and the unsaturated fats always work best with saturated fats. Before we finish this unit on the fat-soluble activators, I want to just mention the nutrients for brain development. The activators, once again, A, D, and K. Choline is critical for brain development. If a baby does not have enough choline during these windows of development, the connections in the brain will not be made. And in traditional cultures, the first food is always liver or egg yolks, and that starts at 6 months. We do not recommend exclusive breastfeeding after 6 months. You want to start giving them these nutrient-dense foods at that time. DHA we find once again in the sacred foods, and zinc. These are the key nutrients for having healthy, intelligent babies. We often hear about nutrient-dense foods and our government telling us to eat fruits and vegetables. So let's just look and see how much nutrition is in 2 typical fruits, the apple, and a typical vegetable, the carrot. Here we have phosphorus, and we're comparing it with red meat and liver. There's no comparison, is there? Look how much higher red meat is and liver is in phosphorus than apples or carrots. Look at the iron here. There's virtually no iron in apples or carrots, but lots in red meat and much more in liver. Zinc, this is the one where red meat is the highest, higher than liver. Copper, B2, vitamin A. There's no vitamin A in apples, there's no vitamin A in carrots, and a little bit in red meat and a lot in liver. Vitamin C, there's actually more vitamin C in liver than there is in carrots and apples. And 2 very critical nutrients that we get from animal foods, B6, much higher in liver, and B12. Look at the liver even compared to the red meat. So I hope this inspires you to eat liver at least once a week. You know, you can get your more B12 from eating 1 serving of liver a month than from eating meat 3 times a day. And calcium. Now, the primitive diets had at least 1,500 milligrams per day in the diet, much higher than the government recommended amount. We could get 1,500 milligrams in 5 cups of whole milk, which is 805 calories, or 7 to 8 ounces of cheese, which is 900 calories, or 40 carrots. If you want to eat 40 carrots, that'll give you 1,500 milligrams of calcium. That's 1,680 calories. If you want to get your calcium from ice cream, and a lot of people do get their calcium from ice cream. That's why they crave ice cream. But that's 2,500 calories. If you want to get your calcium from chocolate cupcakes, you'd have to eat 32 cupcakes, over 4,000 calories. If you want to get your calcium from almonds, they're a good source of calcium, but that's 4,000 calories, and from whole wheat bread, 78 slices. So this is what we mean when we say nutrient dense. You get your nutrients with not taking in a lot of calories. And of course, this is why people crave things. Why are people binging on ice cream and chocolate cupcakes? Because their body is starving for these nutrients, and they're not eating the foods that would provide these nutrients at much lower levels of calories. Should we cook our food? All cultures cook some or most of their food. All cultures cooked. So we should cook our food. Cooking neutralizes a lot of toxins, liberates nutrients, makes foods more digestible, especially grains and especially vegetables. These cultures cooked most of their green foods. But they always ate some of their animal foods raw. This was almost universal. Examples of raw animal foods include raw milk, butter, and cream, raw cheeses, raw and marinated fish, raw shellfish, such as oysters, and traditional ethnic raw meat dishes such as steak tartare, carpaccio, and kibbe. Kibbe is raw lamb from the Middle East. And it's fascinating to me that every European culture has at least one raw meat dish that they eat on occasion. One of the reasons that raw animal foods are so important is because they supply B6. B6 is very fragile, it's destroyed easily by heat, and B6 deficiency is linked to all of these modern diseases: diabetes, heart disease, nervous problems, cancer, kidney failure, which is a huge problem, asthma, and so forth. One of the interesting ones is alcoholism is linked to B6 deficiency. Alcoholics need to get on a lot of raw animal food, raw milk and raw meat. So we will talk about raw milk this afternoon, but raw cheeses are available everywhere, and raw cheese is a complete food if it's really raw and if the animals have been on pasture. It's a source of calcium, phosphorus, all the vitamins, B6, B12, the activators, A, D, and K, and it will also be a source of B6. The fifth underlying characteristic in the traditional diets is that they had high levels of enzymes and beneficial bacteria. And I like to think of the enzymes as being these fellows with big turbans on, because in the cells, the enzymes are the magic workers. They are the catalyst for everything that happens in your body. You could not heal or move an arm and a leg or do anything in your body without enzymes. There's three major categories of enzymes. The metabolic enzymes, which are produced in all the cells of the body. Many of these are involved in detoxification. Your body's always house cleaning. And if you're eating a good, healthy diet, you don't need to be on these very severe fasts and things to keep your body clean and to detoxify. The enzymes will do it for you. Then you have the digestive enzymes. There are about 22 of these. They are made by the pancreas and the salivary glands, and they're involved in digestion. The other source of enzymes is the food. Some foods contain enzymes, amylases for digesting carbohydrates, lipases for digesting fat, and proteases for digesting proteins. When you have a lot of enzymes in your food, the body doesn't have to work so hard to produce enzymes for digestion. And studies were done with dogs where they put them on a diet where all the food was cooked, and they found that these dogs, when they did an autopsy, had a very large pancreas and salivary glands, what they call hypertrophy, expanded, swollen, because they had to work so hard. These organs had to work so hard. Something has to give, and these organs were much too large. Other organs were smaller. The first organ to shrink was the brain, and the other organs that were drastically shrunk were the reproductive organs. If you want to have a normal sex life and be smart, you need to have lots of enzymes in your food. Remember the Eskimos and their observation that if they ate fermented food, they'd have more stamina and more strength. That's because fermented food is full of enzymes, and that spares your digestion. And that's one of the main reasons for eating these fermented foods. So the body needs enzymes, and the enzymes are not in cooked foods. They're only in certain raw foods. When you cook the foods, you destroy the enzymes. Examples of enzyme-rich foods include raw dairy products. Raw dairy products are loaded with enzymes. That's one of the reasons that raw milk is such a healthy food and such a strength-giving food. Raw meat and fish. Raw honey is a wonderful source of enzymes, amylases for digesting carbohydrates. The tropical fruits are great sources of enzymes. Now, the fruits from this part of the world, grapes and apples and that type of fruit, are not good sources of enzymes. Cold-pressed oils, such as extra virgin olive oil, wine and unpasteurized beer. But what we were going to look at more this afternoon is the lacto-fermented foods, which are enzyme enhanced. This is a way of preserving foods that greatly increases the enzymes. Vegetables, meats, dairy products, fruits, fish, and beverages can all be lacto-fermented. And of course, the lacto-fermented food you're most familiar with is sauerkraut, which when eaten raw is a wonderful source of enzymes. These foods are also wonderful sources of bacteria. And we've been taught to be afraid of bacteria. That's the old paradigm, that the human body is sterile and that bacteria attack it and make us sick. And that's the paradigm that's created antibiotics and all of this sterilized food. We now know that the healthy body lives in symbiotic with microorganisms. We have about 6 pounds of bacteria if we're healthy in our digestive tract. And these are actually what digest our food. They help us assimilate, they create nutrients, they are a first defense against toxins. These bacteria prevent the absorption of mercury, aluminum, pesticides. They are protectors in the intestinal tract. And they help us feel good. They actually create or manufacture feel-good chemicals. So without these good bacteria, we're dead, and we don't feel good on the way to the grave. This is now recognized. The gut needs good bacteria for us to be healthy. So we recommend the consumption of these lacto-fermented condiments. We eat them with cooked food. We call these super raw foods. You don't have to eat all raw, but as long as you're eating small amounts of these super raw fermented foods, then you're getting the enzymes and the good bacteria that you need. And you can also do this with beverages. And there are many wonderful lacto-fermented beverages for sale at the conference today. Kombucha and kvass are beverages from Russia. And this is a drink made in Australia. It's now available here, the Grainfields drink, which is a very energizing, refreshing lacto-fermented beverage. So lots of resources out there for you. The Weston A. Price Foundation, which provides a lot of good teaching materials. Please visit the New Trends booth for the books on health and nutrition. This seminar is available at the New Trends booth on DVD, and Dr. Price's work will be available at the Price Pottenger Nutrition Foundation booth tomorrow.